The women who came to join their husbands had to cope with the cold and the perpetual changes of residence. The prisoner was constantly being transferred from one place to the other, and the wife had to give up her job, found with great difficulty, to follow him to dangerous areas, where she could be raped, robbed, insulted. On arrival, she would be exposed to the gross advances of the chiefs and the guards who had taken up the morals of Kolyma. With the female prisoners, there was no subtle courtesy. Undress, lie down, and one passed on one's syphilis to her. But to rape a woman prisoner always meant a certain risk. A friend, a subordinate, or a superior could denounce you. With prisoners' wives, this risk did not exist. Juridically, they were independent persons, and they were not protected by any law. 28. But above all, this immensely long journey proved to be useless. The unhappy woman did not get permission to see her husband. Promises for an interview were accompanied by precise propositions. The woman did not find work near the place of detention. If by chance she did manage to, the husband was immediately transferred. This was not a game on the part of the authorities, it was an order. Moscow had foreseen everything. The wife could not give him food, forbidden by regulations. Have a guard give him the food. It's forbidden. He's afraid to. A chief. All right, but pay with your body. What about money? He has too much, he doesn't know what to do with it. The wife certainly hasn't got the amount necessary to grease the palms, especially the Kolyma palms. Anyway, there's no way out. Some got a 3-year permit, but caught in this trap, they took the first boat back. The strongest, and you needed to have more strength than the prisoners themselves, waited out their time, and went back without having seen their husbands. The weakest, obsessed by the persecution of which they had been victims on the mainland, and fearing to return there, cashed in on their bodies. They remembered, had children, and forgot the prisoner, in forgetting themselves. 28. A woman prisoner, when freed, was in a difficult position. It was impossible to live alone. She would be molested wherever she went, persecuted by employers unless she submitted to them, sexually attacked and raped if out after dark, incessantly importuned. On the other hand, the shortage of women was such that many free men sought out wives, even among prisoners 20 or so years older than themselves. "I'm off to get a wife," one former prisoner said, with a light smile. "A wife at the fancy market at the Elgin State Farm. I want to marry." He came back that same evening, with a wife. Not far from the Elgin State Farm, at the exit of the village, there was a petrol station. Former prisoners would come in the evening, in cars, and choose a companion. It was the assembly point for newly liberated women. The huts were all around in the bushes. Proposals of marriage were made quickly, like everything in Kolyma except the sentences. The cars went off with the newlyweds. The bushes were high and leafy enough for, if necessary, closer acquaintance on the spot. 28. It was common for a woman to settle with a man, regain her health and looks, and then to cash in on her rarity value with a richer man. The shortage of women led, soon after the war, to an appeal to young communist girls to go to Kolyma as voluntary workers. Several hundred applied. They were made the object of a great propaganda exercise. After a short time, however, reports of their heroic actions could only be used in papers outside Kolyma, since in the region itself too much was known about what had happened to them. For Kolyma not only killed, it also corrupted. Those who came through whole needed luck, certainly. They also needed extraordinary qualities of personality. Chapter 8. A clownish interlude. One of the most extraordinary and disgraceful things about Kolyma is that its mere existence was ignored or denied in the West over a period of some 20 years. This is of course true of the whole labor camp system. But there is the added irony that Kolyma was the one such area actually visited by a prominent delegation of Westerners, who managed to see no evil, hear no evil, and speak no evil about it. This Western attitude to Stalin's camp system was not due to lack of evidence. No impenetrable security curtain was required. Individual reports from survivors who had reached the West existed even before the war. Reports from the hundreds of Poles who had served in the Kolyma camps themselves and been permitted to leave the Soviet Union in 1941-3 under the Soviet-Polish Treaty were soon available. On the basis of these, in 1945, Morrow and Zwimak gave a comprehensive account of the whole system throughout the USSR, with special attention to 8 great camp clusters under Dalstroy. In 1946, Polish eyewitness stories were collected, with a preface by T.S. Eliot, In the Dark Side of the Moon Y, including a number of experiences from Kolyma. In 1948, the Old Mensheviks, D.J. Dalin and Boris I. Nikolevsky published their classic Forced Labor in Soviet Russia, which listed 15 camps or camp clusters in the Kolyma and gave a long and generally accurate account of the history and conditions of the area. In 1951, Eleanor Lipper's 11 Years in Soviet Prison Camps appeared, and in the same year, Vladimir Petrov's / Happens in Russia. Both of them full and careful descriptions, from the prisoner's point of view, of the Kolyma camps. By now, in fact, dozens of first-hand reports had appeared in the West, and all of them consistent with each other, all of them true. Over the Stalin period, a certain number of accounts of the area were published in the USSR. These were designed to give not only a false but a totally imaginary picture of Kolyma. Berzin himself provided an Arcadian view in the Moscow press as early as 1935. 25 Kolyma Land of Marvels by N. Zadorny, a series published in Izvestia in 1944. 6 has possibly less relation to reality even than other material published in the Stalin epoch, though in the far north Kolyma, in Djurka 21 by S. Boldov runs it close. The accepted legend about the building of Kolyma as of certain other areas was that the work had been done by volunteer young communists. This theme is strongly pressed by none other than Nikishov in a radio address on the occasion of the 1946 elections in the area. 27. It is more surprising to find the falsehood repeated in Izvestia 20 years later, 7 at the height of the Khrushchev interlude, especially as the true story, or part of it, was even then becoming temporarily available in other Soviet publications, as we have seen. For it was at this time, of course, that it became absolutely clear that the accounts given by Dalin, Lipper and the others were completely accurate. Material actually published in the Soviet Union confirmed them in every detail. There were, in particular, the memoirs of General Ivy Gorbatov and Grigory Shilist's Kolyma notes, and in addition to what actually passed the Soviet censor and got into print, there was a good deal of samizdat material, which was published abroad without getting its writers into difficulties at home, in particular Evgenia Ginsberg's Into the Whirlwind, and the passages on Kolyma in Roy Medvedev's Let History Judge. Readers will have seen how in earlier chapters the Soviet material, even the Soviet official material, confirms the earlier stories printed in the West. The ration scales, the locations, names and conditions in the individual camps, the continuous threat of death, the conduct of the authorities towards the common criminals, and the conduct of the latter towards the politicals, the conditions aboard steamers, like the Jherma, in every way, the earlier accounts and analyses are thoroughly vindicated. In The Great Terror, I gave a number of examples of distinguished Westerners nourishing extravagant delusions about Stalin's Russia. The credulity, stubbornly defended against overwhelming odds in the way of evidence, marked a whole generation of Western left-wingers. Nor in that book did I have space for more than a selection. I omitted, for example, Sir Julian Huxley's prize-winning fantasy that Stalin used personally to go down to the yards to help unload railway trucks. I did not even mention Dr. Edith Summerskill's egregious remarks to the effect that Ivan the Terrible was to be remembered primarily for bringing some Western doctors to Russia, as a fact far outweighing any atrocities he may have committed. And that similarly, Soviet executions were more than counterbalanced by some hospitals she had been shown. Might it not have been tentatively suggested to her that, even on a strictly medical view, execution could also be held to have a bad effect on the health? Nor can we maintain that the final establishment of the facts really ended these delusions. Bronus Wooten, writing in the mid-60s, recalled her shame when in the 30s, she went to Russian schools only to be greeted with the cry, "You come from England, where they beat children." The retorts, some of them available even at the time, seem fairly obvious. You live in Russia, where they beat grown-ups. You live in Russia, where they shoot children. And to complete the story, you live in Russia, where they beat children, and not only beat, but submit them as was done to Peter Yecker, when he was 14 or 15 to tortures like the strappado, which have not been employed even on adults, for several centuries in Britain. How was it possible that the clear, cool and consistent material available and published in the West was not believed? What emerges is a sorry tale of self-deception. Few went as far as Jean-Paul Sartre, who argued, in effect, that accounts of the Soviet labor camp system should be suppressed even if true, since otherwise the French working class might become anti-Soviet. In France indeed, Kolyma itself was made a public issue, in an extraordinarily revealing way, in an exchange in court, in the libel suit brought in 1950, by David Rousset, of the Commission contre le régime concentrationnaire, against the communist Les Lettres Françaises, which had accused him of falsifying a quotation from the Soviet penal code. A leading communist defendant, M. Jean Lafitte, was asked if labor camps, like those which have been described to us, exist at Kolyma, would you agree to condemn them? Lafitte replied, if you were to ask me, if your mother is a murderer, would you condemn her? I would reply, sir, my mother is my mother, and will not be a murderer. Similar, if less explicit, processes seem to have taken place in many Western minds. Perhaps by now, there are not many people who are unaware of what happened and what is happening in the Soviet Union. This is certainly a great gain. All the same, the cast of mind, which so long and so stubbornly resisted the truth has, all too often, merely turned to more recently totalitarianized countries, to project on them its visions of utopia. Bertrand Russell wrote the preface to one labor camp book published in 1951 *, which concluded with letters from eminent communists, saying that no such camps exist. He commented, those who write these letters, and those fellow travelers, who allow themselves to believe them, share responsibility for the almost unbelievable horrors, which are being inflicted upon millions of wretched men and women, slowly done to death by hard labor and starvation in the Arctic cold. Fellow travelers who refuse to believe the evidence are necessarily people devoid of humanity, for if they had any humanity, they would not merely dismiss the evidence, but would take some trouble to look into it. Such themes are well illustrated by one of the most absurd, and from every point of view, horrifying events in the whole history of the Soviet labor camp system: the short stay in Kolyma of the Vice President of the United States, Henry A. Wallace, with a group of advisors, headed by Professor Owen Latimer, representing the Office of War Information, in the summer of 1944. It is not quite unique, since in the early 30s there were odd visits by Western figures well disposed to the Soviet regime, like Bernard Shaw, to the timber-producing areas near Archangel. The idea was to refute allegations that the Soviet timber then being dumped in Western markets was produced by slave labor. The method of refutation was the dismantling of the barbed wire and sentries towers, and the marching of *A World Apart by Gustav Herrling. The prisoners into the depths of the forest, for a few days, under conditions which can be imagined. This proved effective. The Wallace-Latimer visit to Kolyma, though presenting certain parallels, was much more remarkable. For one thing, they were not concerned to refute allegations about slave camps, since, as is clear from what they wrote afterwards, no such allegations had ever reached them, or if they had been repressed beyond conscious recall. Nor, of course, was the Vice President of the United States selected by the Soviet government, like those earlier visitors, for its own purposes. For him and his companions, Kolyma was no more than a convenient staging post on their flight from the United States to China, though it was indeed one which, as they saw it, gave them the opportunity over their 3-day stay to gather useful impressions of the development of this rarely visited area of Soviet Asia. Both Wallace and Latimer published enthusiastic accounts. In his book, Soviet Asia Mission, Wallace tells us that the gold miners at Kolyma are big husky young men who came out to the Far East from European Russia *. He adds that they are pioneers of the machine age, builders of cities. He was much impressed by the horrible Nikishov, who enchanted him when he gambled about enjoying the wonderful air immensely. One prisoner comments on this: "It is too bad that Wallace never saw him gamboling about on one of his drunken rages around the prison camps, raining filthy, savage language upon the heads of the exhausted, starving prisoners, having them locked up in solitary confinement, for no offense whatsoever, and sending them into the gold mines to work 14 and 16 hours a day, at no matter what human cost." 13 of the frightful Goglets, whom Wallace met later, describing him as president of the executive committee of the Khabarovsk, a nice civilian post, and more accurately, as an intimate friend of Stalin, he writes, "Goglets is a very fine man, very efficient, gentle and understanding with people." Nikishov's wife, Gridasova, the commandant of the women's camp at Magadan, of whom the best that can be said is that she did not actually make lampshades out of human skin, also made a splendid impression on Wallace, with her efficiency, maternal solicitude and little unostentatious attentions. He was introduced to her at an extraordinary exhibit of paintings and embroidery, copies of famous Russian landscapes. These had been made, Wallace tells us, by a group of local women, who gathered during the severe winter, to study needlework. 2 of the pictures were presented to Wallace by Nikishov. He was unable to tell Wallace who had done them, but Wallace later learned that this was typical modesty, for the director of the exhibit told him that they had in fact been done by Gridasova, described as one of the art teachers. In fact, the group of local women who had produced all the needlework were female prisoners, mainly former nuns, who were able to supplement their meager rations by doing such work for the Kolyma police elite. This was a very minor deception, of course. The operation designed to conceal the facts from Wallace and his companions was conceived, however, on a vast scale. The wooden watchtowers, which lined the road into Magadan, were pulled down. During the 3 days of the visit, no prisoners, who usually provided much of the city's labor force, were let out. Moreover, in case the visitors happened to pass close by, no prisoners were allowed even in the camp yard. Instead, they were kept indoors, and films were played to them over the whole period. Wallace went to an evening performance at Magadan's Gorky Theatre. The actors, who were prisoners, were loaded on their trucks and sent back to camp immediately after the performance. And while on this cultural theme, we may note Wallace reporting that Mr. Nikishov and his friends also expressed themselves as very pleased with a phony pro-Soviet Hollywood film called North Star, which gave an idyllic picture of life on a Soviet collective farm. The shops of Magadan had their windows full of Russian products, scraped up from all over the region. For the previous 2 years there had been very little in these windows, and that mostly of American, Lend-Lease origin. One free citizen is reported as slipping into a shop at the same time as Wallace, and buying food, which had long since vanished in the ordinary course of events. Another followed, but by now Wallace had left, and the citizen was told that the goods were not for sale. Of conditions in the area, Wallace comments, "The 8-hour day is the legal work day in Soviet Russia. Paid overtime was put in as a wartime necessity. Minors under 18 worked an 8-hour day, and in the evening attended continuation school, free of charge." These are the actual working conditions we found, and the wage differential of about 3-1 in favor of Dalstroy seemed real enough, since ration rates at Magadan were the same as in Moscow. Compared to mine laborers in old Russia, the men in overalls on the Kolyma had many more rubles to spend. 37 Wallace, whose background was of course agricultural, was taken out to the farm, 23 kilometers from Magadan, normally a penal camp. He asked the well-dressed girl swineherds a polite question about their work, which caused some confusion, as they were in fact NKVD office staff, selected for their looks and smartness and had little knowledge of pigs. However, the interpreter saved the situation. The party flew from Magadan to Smchan and then to Berylyk, in the heart of the area of the penal mines. We have already had occasion to recount prisoners' experiences in Berylyk. Wallace describes his visit there. "We were flown north along the Kolyma road to Berylyk, where we saw 2 placer gold mines. The enterprise displayed here was impressive. Development was much more energetic than at Fairbanks, although conditions were more difficult at Berylyk. Gold, coal, and lead mining are the explanation of nearly everything in the Kolyma region, where there are now about 300,000 persons in the community. More than 1,000 mines are in operation, it was said 37. He noted the good clothing issued to the miners. We were surprised to find the Kolyma gold miners wearing United States rubber boots because our Lend-Lease policy had always denied anything requested for gold mining anywhere in the world, including Soviet Russia. They were bought for cash in the early days of the war, Nikishov explained. The miners asked me to take back a message of solidarity to the people of the United States. Their trade union leader, N.I. Adigan, sent his best regards to Sidney Hillman and Philip Murray. 37 Wallace's comment on camp food is also interesting, in its way. The delicious fresh Kolyma River fish served us near Barylyk led me to inquire about the presiding chef of this mining camp. Professor Latimore wrote about the visit in an article which appeared with photographs in the National Geographic magazine for December 1944. After noting the deplorable methods by which Siberia had been colonized in Tsarist times, he went on to celebrate the enlightened system, which had replaced them. The orderly development of the Soviet North was controlled by a remarkable concern. This was Dalstroy, which constructs and operates ports, roads and railways, and operates gold mines and municipalities, and which Latimore maintained, can be roughly compared to a combination of the Hudson Bay Company and the TVA*. This Soviet development was superior not only to the Tsar's methods but also to the American-style gold rushes with their sin, gin and brawling. Instead, greenhouses provided tomatoes, cucumbers and even melons to make the hardy miners got enough vitamins*. On this point, a prisoner tells of an energetic and tenacious woman head of a hospital. Once she set her mind on something, as for example, building a greenhouse to raise tomatoes, she would if necessary obtain the glass from Magadan more than 300 miles away. Naturally, a good part of the tomatoes were eaten by herself and her superiors in the camp and public health administrations of the gold mining region, and very few of the tomatoes reached the patients. But had it not been for her, no patients at all would have received so much as half a tomato. 13 No prisoner not in hospital, that is to say no miner, ever did see a tomato, or any such luxury. As for the other vitamins, on which according to Latimore, the miners flourished, we have described the deadly fiasco with the pine needle broth, which represented the only attempt to provide them. We need only note once again, in this context, that polyavitaminosis is one of the regularly reported causes of death. Latimore was equally impressed by the ballet high-grade entertainment, on which he approvingly quoted a colleague's remark, that it just naturally seems to go with gold, and so does high-powered executive ability. This latter had certainly been shown. The cover operation had been well conceived, and efficiently executed, though one may feel that the visitors failed to exhibit the sharpest critical acuity. Nikishov, who had reason to congratulate himself, made as good an impression on Latimore as he did on Wallace. He seems to have dropped his rank for the visit, civil status doubtless seeming more appropriate for the idle Wallace, and Latimore thought they saw. At any rate, Latimore too calls him Mr. Nikishov, the head of Dalstroy, and rejoices that he had just been decorated with the Order of Hero of the Soviet Union for his extraordinary achievements. Even more remarkably, Latimore felt able to add that both he and his wife have a trained and sensitive interest in art and music, and also a deep sense of civic responsibility. 12 The illustrations to Latimore's article fully accord with what he writes in it. He was able, for example, to print a photograph of a group of well-clad and physically fit men, taken at a gold mine, visited under conditions similar to that at the pig farm. These men bear little physical resemblance to the prisoners normally to be found at the site. The caption is "They have to be strong to resist winter's rigors." It is of course true that one had to be strong to survive a Kolyma winter. But with the prisoners things worked out the other way. Since they were not expected to withstand its rigors, it was not found necessary to keep them strong. The present writer had occasion to refer in an earlier book to this absurd interlude in the dreadful tragedy of Kolyma. A reviewer in the New Statesman was among those who expressed distaste at the credulousness of Latimore and the others. In reply, Latimore found it appropriate to write a letter New Statesman, 18th October 1968, in which he asked, "Is it assumed that a visit of this kind affords an ideal Opportunity to snoop on one's hosts. 1. This is, let us say, an odd way of putting it. Accounts were already available about the true situation from Poles who had been released from the area. And even the most polite observer might perhaps have kept his eyes open to see if the sites presented officially were truly inconsistent with those reports. More strikingly, it is difficult to fathom how even the politest foreign visitor felt obliged, after such meager contact, to insist on the deep sense of civic responsibility of General Nikishov. Latimore goes on to comment in his letter that Nikishov must have slipped up, since Eleanor Lipper eventually got out. The fact that there were survivors is thus used to imply that things were not so bad as they were painted, while if there had been no survivors, no evidence contradicting Latimore's idyllic picture would have been available. An interesting example of having it both ways. Latimore, whose tone throughout is of a levity some might find inappropriate to the subject, adds that the cream of the jest 5 was that the National Geographic magazine, in its conservatism, did not wish him to give publicity to Vice President Wallace. A conventional diversion constitutes the nub of Latimore's self-exculpations. In the original German edition of her book, Eleanor Lipper, not having seen them, did not go into Latimore's and Wallace's writings on the matter. In the English edition, she added some, not unnaturally rather critical remarks. In his New Statesman letter, Latimore explains all this quite simply. It was done at the behest of some sinister unknown, as part of the McCarthyism, which was then rampant in the United States. In his old age, Latimore became a hero for the younger sociologists and others in the United States, being leonized at their conventions. His qualifications were twofold. He had opposed American policy, and Senator Joseph McCarthy had falsely accused him of being a leading Soviet SP. The real evidence of Latimore's record on Stalinism was that seldom referred to by himself or his apologists, which appears in the 2-volume report of the McCarran Committee hearings on his Institute of Pacific Relations. The evidence was overwhelming that the Institute and its journal were tightly linked to communist, and specifically to Soviet, circles, and that its line was Stalinoid. The left-wing New Republic, which had generally defended him, finally concluded 14 July 1952, the report will, we believe, substantiate these charges. That a Communist Party caucus infiltrated the staff and council of the American IPR before the last war. That IPR officials knew of this infiltration and tolerated it, and that the IPR gave up its objective research function and adopted the role of advocate in China policy. The record will further indicate that Owen Latimore knowingly accepted these trends and that he erred in professing naivete or ignorance before the committee. For indeed, Latimore's role as an apologist for the Soviet regime went back a good way. In his journal Pacific Affairs September 1938, he discussed, for example, the Moscow trials. Asking himself if they represented a triumph for democracy, he answered that the purge of top officials showed the ordinary citizen his power to denounce even them, and concluded that sounds like democracy to me. Anyone who could think in this way might indeed have found Kolyma admirable, even if he had seen it as it was. Wallace, before he died, expressed his regret at having so deeply misunderstood the Soviet Union. Latimore has never done so. It may be that in these cases, the more innocent dupes are the ones who do the greatest damage, at least in the short run, which may nevertheless be disastrous. Still, it is hard not to reserve one's harsher condemnation for those who could and should have known better, and for the adulators who later excused them. In any case, even the harshest words are scarcely as painful as the suffering of the victims of Kolyma, so unforgivably misrepresented in this episode. More important yet, a clear and even pitiless account of it may serve to instruct the public and to discourage potential future offenders. And there we must leave these special and temporary inhabitants of our region. But what has been said in this chapter is by no means a digression. Granted that this particular case, with Western well-wishers of Stalinism, actually brought to the location of some of its largest horrors, is the most extreme example ever to have occurred, it nevertheless demonstrates a major side of Stalin's whole system, based, as Pasternak put it, on the inhuman power of the lie. For an important part of his whole scheme was precisely the deception of the West. It is particularly appropriate that in addition to the killers and torturers, and the innocent victims, we should be able to find on the very soil of Kolyma that other key element, the dupes and the apologists. Chapter 9: The Death Roll. Cold Auschwitzes of the North. Yuri Galanskov, poet, died 1972, in forced labor camp ZHKH, 385/17. As we said in our introduction, Kolyma killed on a vast scale. No official figures have ever been released either about the number transported, or about the numbers dying. A usual broad estimate is that, as the editor of the Paris edition of Shalamov's pieces puts it, the area employed, depending on the period, from 300,000 to 1 million workers, though the latter figure, for 1950 to 3, seems on the high side. In any case, as we noted, it is rather less difficult, in the case of Kolyma, than of any other part of the Soviet labor camp system, to arrive at an estimate, above all, because the area was supplied by sea, and we have reasonably adequate information about the number of ships involved, their capacity, and their frequency. First, nevertheless, let us consider the problem from the other end, and see what can be deduced in this line from our knowledge of the camps themselves. We have the names of about 106 camps of all types. We also know of the existence of many more. For example, if to the 66 gold camps in operation in 1940, we add 4 more we know of, which later came into use in the Pestra-Dresvu area, that gives us an authenticated minimum total of 70 gold camps, of which we have the names of only just over half, so that there were at least some 30 more besides our 106. Thus all in all we KNOW_OF the existence of some 140 camps, and if we omit a few which were small penal settlements dependent on labor camps proper, we are left with at any rate no fewer than 100 of substantial size, and a single camp 9 in this usage may include more than one site. Moldyak, for example, had in 1944 sites, each holding 2,500 prisoners, in 25 100-man huts. Camps of course differed in the numbers they employed, and these numbers also fluctuated, for various obvious reasons. We can however fairly estimate the normal populations. In the Northern Administration, in 1938, we are told that the partisan mine employed only 3,000 prisoners, while such mines as those at Upper Etterick and Shturmovo were regular townships of 12,000 to 15,000 inhabitants, and elsewhere, quite consistently with this, that the average in the area was 6,000 to 8,000. Similar figures are given throughout the literature. There is no reason to believe that our register of 140 camps is anything like complete, even as to the areas it covers, for the known figure, in a given administration, is often an early one, before later expansion. While we know, for example, that the figures increased in the 2 years 1938 to 40, from about 25 mines, with some 150,000 prisoners, to the 66 mines we have noted with up to 400,000. In addition, we know of several areas, Yanstroy, Chongulf, Chukotsk, in which we cannot specify the names or even the numbers of camps, but which at any rate must have contained not less than 20 more. At its full development, then Kolyma must have contained, at any rate 120 full-scale camps. Of these at least 80 must have been mining camps proper, with from 2,000 to 10,000 inmates, with a probable average of around 5,000. The remainder were fishing, agricultural and similar camps, of around IU inmates each, plus the 80,000 capacity transit camp, and the other camps of Magadan itself. Thus on these rather conservative figures, we reach a total of approximately 500,000, 4/5 of them in the mines, in the later period of Kolyma's history. The figure was of course subject to fluctuation, and especially to increase, as new areas came into operation and new mines opened in the old, though it is also true that some mines were exhausted and closed down, for example, in 1942. From collation of the Polish evidence, it appears that in 1940 to 1942, when the Poles were released, the Kolyma prison population was usually in the range of 300,000–400,000. The figure of 300,000 in 1942 is given by a man who worked in the Magadan gold mining office. Henry Wallace in 1944 was told that the population was 300,000, presumably with about 250,000 of them prisoners. This was certainly near the lowest point, and thence forward there was a continual increase. In general, if from 1937 we take a figure of 150,000, increasing to 500,000 or more in the post-war expansion, we shall hardly err by exaggeration. Another, very approximate approach, is to note that the census result for the Magadan province gave a population, in 1939, of 172,988, 30,657 urban, and 142,331 rural, as against 7,580, in 1926. This figure, as always in the census, represents the free population only. If we exclude women, children, free settlers, specialists such as geologists, port officials, and truck drivers, it would seem not unreasonable to think that at any rate not less than some 20,000 of the grand total would have been commandants, guards, and others directly involved in the labor camp system. Estimates from other areas are that the proportion of guards to prisoners was around 1 to 20. If this applied to Kolyma, allowing for fewer actual camp guards and more mobile detachments, that would give us a very rough estimate of 400,000 prisoners. To these population figures we must apply a death rate. There is of course no doubt at all that from 1937 the death rate was extremely high. We have noted Roy Medvedev***'s statement that in the mines, after the war, it was not uncommon for a workforce of 2060 or 3,000 to be able to send only 100 to the goldface. 16, the rest, not yet dead indeed, were in the longer or shorter interim condition, which led to death, just as we are told that of 3,000 Katarga prisoners sent to the Maxim Gorky mine in 1944 only 500 were healthy enough merely to be transferred to Lasso the following year. 800 were incapable, and the rest dead. 13, again, Shalamov tells us, brigades that began the gold mining season, designated by the names of their brigadiers, at the end of the season, did not have a single man left of those who had started, except the brigadier himself, his orderly, and some of his personal friends. The rest of the brigade had been replaced several times during the summer. The gold mine steadily cast its waste products into the hospitals, into the so-called convalescent crews, into invalid settlements, and into common graves. 28. The survival of the brigadiers reminds us greater than moreover that those who did not die included the Urkas, believed to be some 5% of the total prisoners. If they are deducted and counted as part of the persecutors, rather than of the victims, the substantive percentage of prisoner deaths rises proportionately. QF particular intakes, we have some detail. A nurse notes that during 1939 and 1940 the hospital swarmed with patients who had been sentenced in 1937 and 1938**, while after 1941 it was rare for a prisoner sentenced during those years to show up in the hospitals. It was certainly not because all of them had suddenly stopped getting sick, but because they had meanwhile died in the gold mines. 13. Another woman prisoner, sent to Kolyma in 1938, says flatly that the counter-revolutionary intake of that period was practically liquidated within 2 years. We are told, for the labor camp system as a whole, that at this period about a third of the new intake, already physically exhausted and quite unprepared for heavy manual labor, on a minimal ration, died in the first year. In Kolyma, notoriously one of the very worst areas, the proportion must have been higher still, and such is the evidence. On the other hand, a prisoner who worked in one of the camp administrations in 1938 records that the highest figure he heard there for deaths that year, evidently for Kolyma proper only, was 70,000. He takes the then camp population as 250,000, so that 70,000 would amount to 28%, which though low is within the probable range. Another prisoner, who worked in the administration, gives a 300,000 camp population for 1938, but in any case the figure must have varied through each year, rising in summer, falling in winter. Figures spoken of officially and even semi-officially may or may not be more or less accurate. At any rate, we cannot take them as gospel. The period 1940–2 can be more easily checked through the evidence of another category, the Poles, since the survivors were released in 1941–42 after little more than 2 years, and often less, in Kolyma. After the Soviet occupation of eastern Poland, in October 1939, about 1,060,000 Poles were sent to prisoner of war camps, forced settlement, or, about 440,000 of them, to labor camps. About 270,000 died in the period, up to the release of the survivors 2 to 2.5 years later. Leaving aside special operations against prisoners of war, such as the Cayenne massacre, the great majority of these casualties appear to have taken place among the 440,000 who were sent to labor camps, which is to say, as a general estimate, that about half of these died. This ratio is, of course, for the whole labor camp system throughout the Soviet Union, most of which did not equal the lethal effects of Kolyma. In Kolyma, therefore, we can certainly assume a higher death rate, and we are in fact told that no Poles at all returned of 3,000 sent to the Chukotsk camps. And in a less extreme area, one notes that at Moldyak, in the first 2.5 months, out of the total of 20 Poles in my group, 16 died. 4, including myself, survived. 2 at Komsomolets, there were 46 survivors, out of 436. By September 1941, 60% of those held in the rather less rigorous camps on the Kolyma River had died. 2 in all, of 10,000 12,000 Poles sent to Kolyma in 1940, and 1941, 583 survived to return under the amnesty between October 1941 and July 1942. 17 even on the best assumptions, this must give a figure of some 75 to 80% dead per annum. Virtually all the Poles were at hard labor, and it is to that category that the figure must be applied. In the post-war period, to take a further special case, the Ukrainian nationalists were liquidated very quickly. These were normally under sentence of katorga. And here we face a problem. On the whole, the katorga prisoners were held in distant areas, from which, precisely because they all died, we have virtually no reports. We have mentioned the Poles in the Chon Gulf, and our information on the camps there is virtually nil. Similarly with, for example, the Tyankino-Detrinsk administration, where prisoners condemned to special rigor were also concentrated. This means that direct reports of death rates are from camps which had at any rate some survivors, so that estimates based on such reports are probably extraordinary, though it may appear on the low side. Nor do we have any clear idea of the proportion of katorga prisoners to others. But at any rate, even in the non-katorga mining camps, we regularly hear of a death rate of not less than 20% per annum, even in good years, for example, in Pestrodresva. In 1949-31 the extreme death rate for miners was of course brought down when other employees in the mining camps were included, while we must also take into account the non-mining camps, many of them deadly enough but at least not as bad as the gold areas. If we allow, as all reports imply, an average rate of some 30 to 35% for miners, we may accept a much quoted figure of 25% per annum for Kolyma as a rough average, though the total must depend on each year's numbers and conditions. And now we may turn to the most detailed and substantial part of our evidence, that of the prison ships of the Nagevo run. We shall not find, needless to say, a complete register of every run, with an accompanying bill of lading, specifying the numbers of each convict cargo. But we shall find, by detective work, among the various items of information available, a fairly clear pattern, which will pin down within reasonable limits the numbers transported to Kolyma, mainly to their deaths, over our whole period. We list, in Appendix A, every ship of which we have a report, together with the details, obtained from Lloyd's Register of Shipping. But helpful though Lloyd's Register is in providing information never previously collated, it is defective in certain respects. The Soviet Union did not make reports on shipping matters, or at any rate not full or adequate ones. This can readily be seen from the fact that the Dalstroy is given as having been called Yagoda until 1939, whereas the name must have been changed no later than the time of Yagoda's arrest in April 1937. Similarly, the name Nikolai Yazhov appears in the register until the late 40s, while his name must have been removed when he became a non-person early in 1939. and in fact the ship is reported by prisoners, under the later name Felix Dzerzhinsky, even before the war. When we consider our list, the first point to be made is that we may be erring on the side of underestimate. Number of ships are known only by a single report, and there may well be others, which no one has named. The first Indigirka, for example, is mentioned by a single ex-prisoner, and solely in connection with its loss, in December 1939, as reported by a survivor, eventually sent back to Kolyma. Lloyd's Register also reports its wreck at this date, which became known because the survivors were picked up by Japanese ships, but the Indigirka had certainly made other voyages that season and possibly earlier, though it is not listed in other accounts of the ships then plying in those waters. When it comes to the second Indigirka, the only reason we are able to list it at all is that on checking the first one, in Lloyd's Register, we find the second one, registered at Nagevo, which indicates that it was a full-time Dalstroy vessel. Again, the Kim is known only from a single though highly detailed report, and the Kulu, another Nagevo register, only appears in the account of the arrival of the May 1938 convoy of which Solzhenitsyn retails an eyewitness report. Our list is probably incomplete. In addition to ships we only know of from the odd report, the Soviet merchant fleet included vessels with such names as Kolyma and the Sovetskaya Gavin, of which nothing is known, but which on the analogy of the Kulu, the Indigirka, etc., presumably operated in the area. Still it seems improbable that this deficiency will greatly affect our conclusions. The main and permanent ships of the operating fleet are well known, and frequently reported. The ships based on Nagevo constituted Dalstroy's permanent fleet. There were, as far as our knowledge goes, 6 of them. And if they were not all under Dalstro greater than, at the same time, we can nevertheless always identify a squadron of 4 or 5. These were supplemented during the Okhotsk navigation season by the ships registered at Nakodka or Vladivostok, presumably depending on the mutual convenience of the authorities and the demand for cargo space. The ships used in 1932, during the original mass settlement, the Sverstroy greater than, the Skatterstroy and the Volkhovstra CY, are not reported at a later period. In 1933, the Rabohi took a cargo of forced labor from Archangel to Mbarkik, at the mouth of the Kolyma River, on the Arctic Ocean. Another route, on which the notorious Terma first appears in the literature, was the long haul from Vladivostok through the Bering Strait to the same area. Tens of thousands of prisoners were certainly transported thus in convoys, led by the icebreaker Sakhalin Karat, as also to intermediate camp areas on the route such as the Chukotsk Peninsula and Pivot on the Chon Gulf. We have no means of estimating this, and in any case, a few scores of thousands of prisoners do not make much difference one way or another to the enormous figures which we can arrive at on the regular routes. The main route ran, as we have seen, greater than from Vladivostok to the port of Nagevo. After the outbreak of war, in 1941, Vladivostok became a military supply port, and the prison ships were switched to nearby Nakodka. The voyage led through the Straits of La Perouse, between Hokkaido and what was, until 1945, Japanese Sakhalin. Later an alternative and shorter route came into operation, running, when a railway was established, from the main Trans-Siberian line to the sea, at that point from Vanino, just north of Sovetskaya Gavin, to Nagevo. We must of course allow for a certain flexibility to cope with variations, both in the supply of prisoners, and in the demand from Kolyma. We have indeed seen that the death rate and the principles producing that death rate did not vary much, which means in turn that in the longer run the rate of replacement can never have very greatly diminished, that particularly bad and comparatively good years can be balanced against each other without any great problem. Nevertheless, there were variations. For example, 1942 and 1943 showed a falling off in the numbers of prisoners, while at the same time, the death rate of those who remained shot up, ration scales becoming tougher, and executions on grounds of sabotage, for failure to fulfill the norm, being the usual procedure. It is difficult to quantify this. An estimate of a 70,000 intake in 1942 comes from a German ex-prisoner of war. The area remained operational, even though the emphasis was to some degree transferred from gold no longer necessary due to American Lend-Lease to lead and other products. But the Dalsturkey, for example, is reported as being taken off the Nagevo route in 1942 and used to bring military supplies from the United States. By 1944 things returned to the old level. By this time arrests were proceeding on a vast scale in the liberated regions, and the prospect of victory implied that gold would soon again become a major state interest in dealing with the outside world. After the war, the numbers in the labor camp system greatly increased, and by 1952 reached their probable maximum, generally believed to be in the region of 1 to 14 million. This is nearly twice as many as the total in 1940. And there is no reason to think that Kolyma was any exception. On the contrary, following the end of Lend-Lease, gold again became an urgent priority for the regime, in fact more than it had ever been. Generally speaking, over the whole period, the number of ships on the route seems to have varied from 4 or 5 to 9 or 10. Solzhenitsyn describes a convoy of 4 ships arriving at Nagevo in the spring of 1938-32, and at least 2 others are known to have operated that year. Over the period 1937 to 44 ships are elsewhere named as continually on the route, only one of which is named in Solzhenitsyn's convoy. In 1941, 5 new ships together with an additional icebreaker were provided. We are not able to say precisely how many of these ships operated continuously on the passage. The numbers carried varied from ship to ship, and the numbers carried on a given ship might vary somewhat from voyage to voyage, partly because those ships might be carrying other cargoes as well, partly because, as with Soviet prison cells, in case of necessity, there was always room for more. The Cherma is reported to have carried not more than 4,000 in the spring of 1938, but over 6,000 as its average load during the same period, going up to 7,000 in 1939. The 5 ships which came into operation in the latter years are quoted as each carrying about 7,000, a figure which is also specified for one of the earlier 4. The Kim carried only 3,000 in 1947 on the last trip of the season, while another ship is reported with only 5,000 in 1949. A sailor who served on ships of the Magadan run from 1937 and again, after being wounded in the war for 8 months in 1942, says that in 1937 to 44 ships usually. The Felix Dzerzhinsky, the Dalstroy, the Sovletvia after 1940, and the Cherma carried 6,000 to 9,000 prisoners per trip. 3*. It is of course not necessarily easy, especially for a prisoner, to estimate the numbers on board. This problem should not, perhaps, be exaggerated. A prisoner ought to achieve a fairly reasonable accuracy in noting the numbers in his own hold, and multiplying them by the number of holds, 3 on the Cherma. And in some cases, though we have no means of knowing which the figures were, no doubt those being spoken of by crewmen or others. In NEC & Southeast Karat, the range is from about 3,000 to about 9,000 in ordinary conditions. The figure of 6,000 to 9,000, given for 4 of the ships in the immediate pre-war period, deserves attention, as it was provided by the sailor, who knew the route well. If we omit the 9,000 as probably referring to the particularly large Felix Dzerzhinsky, we might then take 6,000 for the Cherma Karat, the day's Troy, and so on. One prisoner suggests that some 4,000 was the most these larger ships could carry, while the smaller held no more than a few hundred. 24. He was himself, however, transported in 1935 before really intensive shipment of prisoners set in. And the Soviet literature is full of accounts of prisoners who believed that a cell or a cattle truck could not possibly hold more than were crammed in at a given moment, only to find the authorities able to double those numbers. Still, if we take 4,000 as an average commitment, we are most unlikely to be exaggerating. The next question is the number of trips per season. This depended on the weather to some degree. We are told that a convoy arriving on 2nd May 1938 from Nagevo was premature, in that the 50-60 mile belt of ice by the coast had not yet quite melted sufficiently. Other accounts have ships arriving in April. The end of the season is given in several accounts as early December, though the end of November is sometimes mentioned. At any rate, a normal season of 7 months, 30 weeks, or 210 days was the planned and average period. On the basis of evidence collated from 62 prisoners, Mora gives the length of the voyage as 5 to 13 days, depending on the type of vessel and the weather. 17 It would normally be the larger vessels, which would take the shorter time, so we should perhaps give an average of 7 to 8 days for the Chermu and similar ships, and 10 to 12 for lesser members of the flotilla, like the Indigirka, which seem in any case to have been largely concerned with the transport of supplies. The Chermu is noted by another source as doing the trip in 5 days, on one occasion, 22, and elsewhere as making the round trip, including unloading at Nagevo, in 14 days. 4 On the voyage, when the fire broke out, see page 34, which was also very stormy, the Nakodka, Nagevo run took it 8 days. The Dalstroy is also reported taking 8 days, in May 1940. One estimate is that 6 days should normally be given for unloading and refueling for every round voyage, though this often seems to have been less, especially when the proportion of prisoners to other imports was high. Moreover, these figures are almost entirely from the period up to 1942, while in the post-war period turnaround was much speeded up. The new port at Vanino gave extra capacity, while Nagevo, which initially could handle only one ship at a time, was continually expanded. The Vanino, Nagevo run, additionally, was at least a day shorter. At any rate, a round trip every 20 days for the main prisoner transports seems reasonably conservative, giving approximately 11 trips a year per vessel. Our sailor witness speaks of 12 to 15 voyages a year, employing an average round trip time of 16 to 17 days. 33 One account gives an impression that at least in 1941, May and July were allotted to the transport of prisoners alone. This would imply maximum loads, and of course, minimum turnabout time, during these periods, with an estimate of 120,000 cent per year on these trips alone, to say nothing of the other 5 months of the season. We know of the occasional diversion of ships from their regular routes. For example, that the Chermu was once diverted for some days to transport a party further northeast, up the Kolyma coast. Again, there were occasions when the schedule was interrupted more drastically, as when the Indigirka was wrecked in 1939, and when the Dalstroy was lost when its supply of explosives for the mines blew up at Vanino in 1946. On the other hand, the demands of Kolyma, involving both gold and politics, certainly took preference over the requirements of local day-to-day shipping, and the other ships in the Far East would be at the disposal of the Dalstroy route in an emergency. All the same, it will be in accordance with our cautious attitude in these matters if we make the conservative assumption that on the average the number of ships was 5, and on the average the number of round trips was 10 a season. We thus find ourselves with 5 main ships, each carrying an average of 4,000 prisoners, and each making 10 trips a year, with 220,000 prisoners being transported annually. This is an average only, for in 1938, for example, at least 6 ships, with at any rate no fewer than 5,000 prisoners each, were in operation, which would mean over 300,000 recruits, consistent with the massive and maximum arrests of that year. And the years following cannot have produced many fewer. If we now take these reasonably conservative figures, and omit for the moment the years 1932 to 6 and 1942 to 3 as cases to be considered separately, in the period from 1937 to 1941 and 1944 to 1953, we reach a figure of 350,000 prisoners. If we take the much lower figure of 50,000 per annum for the years up to I937 greater than and D*94 greater than, we must then add another 350,000, giving a grand total of 3,500,000. On all the figures we have for labor camp casualties, we can hardly allow more than 500,000 to have survived, and this indeed seems a high estimate. Similarly, if we go by camp population and death rate, take a population of 150,000, 400,000 for the years 1937 to 41, of 200,000, 300,000 for 1942 to 3, and of 300,000, 500,000 for 1944 to 53, and DIPT to each case death rates ranging from 20 to 35% according to the reported rigors of particular years, we arrive at a death toll of about 3 million, after including the lesser casualties of 1933 to 6. Thus, and it should once again be stressed that this is based on conservative assumptions, at every point we may take it that Kolyma cost 3 million lives. These figures, though quite clearly within the probable range, are sensitive to the assumptions. 5 ships making 12 journeys a year, with 5,000 prisoners, would bring the figure up to 4 million. Our sailor witness estimates about 1,500,000 arrivals in 1937-40, which would imply a total of around 5,500,000 for the longer